To the first of the afternoon sessions, where we get to enjoy hearing Karl speak. Now, my name's Edmund O'Donovan, and I know Karl. We're on the board at Campion together, and I used to be. Well, I am head of the building committee that's building this building. I used to be the building committee, but now it's easy to get decisions made with a one-person committee, but Karl's been extremely helpful on that. But before I introduce Karl, I'd just like to say a couple of things about the last two papers. One was about your film work, that when you can see the hand of God in the work, then you know he can stop things happening very easily. And when you spoke about one of the actors is a musician and a composer, and you think, wow, we could have looked across the whole world and God stuck him right there for you. So, and with the projects that we've done here, we've had exactly the same. That when we've needed artists and things, they just we couldn't have found them if we'd looked for them, and they just appear for it. And the other thing you said is involving, if we're going to evangelise people, you've got to be dealing with the unevangelised. And we did a church restoration in Brisbane, where we put the high altar and back in the to a church where it had been smashed out in the 70s. And the tradesmen who worked on it, we repainted the ceiling gorgeously and whatever, and the painters could see, they felt like Michelangelo, and they didn't want to go back to their normal jobs when the job was finished. And perhaps one of the funniest instances, the marble people who rebuilt the high altar, they're used to working in the casino and the other places that have marble. The churches haven't really been using marble for a long time. And anyway, the finished result was absolutely spectacular. The redid the sanctuary and everything. But the last thing we did was move back the forward-facing altar, and the tradesmen were aghast, as to what are you doing? It's blocking the view. And anyway, I said it was a bigger conversation than we could have there, but they might don't glue it down. Was what I said to them. And then the talk about the creative process of the Father being the vision, and the beginning and the end's all there before you start. And certainly this project, that's been the case. The beginning and the end's been there, and now we're going through the incarnational agony, I guess. It's anyway, the project's coming along extremely well, but we lost 20 weeks to rain, so that's been... we'd hoped to be, actually, yesterday was our original completion date, so we'll be in before that. Inshallah, it's one of the few times I can say that. The 20th of February will be in. I think that's realistic. All right, to get onto Karl. Karl, whenever I have to introduce Karl, I think of Chesterton's biography of St Francis of Assisi that I read because I wanted to know something about St Francis of Assisi. And when I finished the book, I knew less about St Francis of Assisi than when I started, because Chesterton never wanted to be bogged down in dates and things of that nature. And eventually I figured out what he wanted to do was show why Francis of Assisi was such an important person in human history and why he was injected at that time. And so you can get the dates and the other bits and pieces. So Karl's a bit like that. You don't get the story from when he was born and when he went to school and those other bits and pieces. He's written a little thing for me, and I'll elaborate on it when it's as required. I think I got this job because if anybody's seen the title of this presentation, when Karl introduced Elvis and Heather, he said, I don't want to preempt what they're saying. I'd love to be able to preempt what Karl's saying, but I have no clue. And I'm pleased that Virginia's here because it's
I'm trying to protect you.
Yeah. I wasn't sure that... And I think Virginia's very fond of me, so I can probably introduce Karl and this topic and still maintain the friendship there. So, whereas it's a tricky one. So Karl's been president of the Chesterton Society since 2007, taken over from the late Tony Evans, who founded the Society in 1993. Since 2014, he has edited the Society's quarterly publication, The Defendant. He's now allegedly in retirement, though Virginia might think otherwise. During his career, he was university librarian at the University of New England in Armidale for many years, and in the year 2000 began working as co-founder of Campion College, as the other co-founder said, no Karl, no Campion. So Australia's first and only liberal arts college. For more than 50 years, he has engaged in freelance writing and speaking, both here and internationally. His articles and book reviews on subjects of religion and culture, particularly literature, history and education, have been widely published in outlets such as The Australian, Quadrant, The Spectator, The Catholic Weekly, The Catholic Herald and the New York Journal America. When I first met Karl, my brother said to me, I think I remember him. When my brother was a small boy, he remembered reading articles by this Karl Schmude with a liberal Dominican, was it? Yes. Anyway, and week after week, Karl went back with the sword that yes, throwing everything in the bin is perhaps not the best idea. So, and that would have been about 1970 or something. Yeah. He's also published several short biographies, including one on Chesterton and another on the historian Christopher Dawson. He regards Dawson as the intellectual architect of Campion College, and in fact his work on Dawson has just been released in a second edition by the Christopher Dawson Centre in Hobart, which David is the chairman of, and it's available at the conference. Since 2007 he's organised Chesterton conferences here at Campion and also spoken overseas as well, in Buenos Aires for example in 2006 and Florida at the American Chesterton Society in 2018. He was brought up in Sydney. He lived in Vaucluse House. Last time I introduced him I said he lived in Kirribilli House, which he probably would have not have been as salubrious. But yes, so his childhood was spent in Vaucluse House, the historical home of William Charles Wentworth, where his mother was secretary manager. He moved to Armidale in 1970 after marrying Virginia. They have 4 sons and 14 grandchildren, of whom 10 are sons. Is that what you were saying last week? Okay. At today's conference, and I'm fascinated to see what he's got to say and how Virginia will still be his wife at the end of it, he'll be speaking on Father Brown meets Inspector Clouseau.
How does that seem? Is that okay? Not everybody will want to hear me, of course, but thank you, Edmund, for those words. I was remembering with Heather and Elvis earlier that Malcolm Muggeridge and I attended different public talks that the English journalists gave over the years, and they were usually long introductions, and his classic remark when he stood up was with that particular English accent that he had, well, now that I know who I am, I can't wait to hear what I'm going to say. So, going beyond that, I thought I'd begin this paper with a question. Is it a good idea to try and compare Father Brown and Inspector Clouseau? And I'm sure my friends would have said, no, Karl, it is not a good idea. Virginia would have agreed, though she'd know that I'd seize on any feeble opportunity to do an impersonation of Inspector Clouseau. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the character in the Pink Panther movies, but you'll probably get a fair idea, not only from what I say, but from the clips that Michael is going to present at different points. But a more serious question is whether we can compare 2 characters in different media, and we've been talking about different media quite a lot today, books and movies. Father Brown is a literary character, even if he's been converted at different times into a screen personality on movies and TV. Inspector Clouseau is a movie character only, most notably in the Pink Panther movie starring Peter Sellers. Now, each medium, I think, can bring out certain dimensions of an individual character. The visual medium can make vivid the physical features and actions of a character, and reveal, especially through dialogue, his interior life and character. The literary medium, on the other hand, can develop and reveal a character in depth through dialogue and description, and it can stimulate the imagination of the reader, who has to imagine things that are being read from the printed page. And this is often at a deep level, even more powerfully at times than the visual medium, which is direct and explicit. The literary medium can also provide a forum for exploring and reflecting on reality. Now, there's a further challenge, difficulty really, with our two detectives being presented in different media, the literary and the visual, and that is the issue of visibility. So in the Pink Panther movies, Inspector Clouseau is a prominent presence, and you would expect him really to be the dominant presence. In Chesterton's stories, Father Brown is a rather inconspicuous character a lot of the time. Now, this doesn't quite fit in with the visual medium, which favours the character at the centre. The visual medium calls for prominence. It doesn't readily recognise or reward the unassuming and the humble. The British author Michael Newton has observed Father Brown often makes his first appearance in the stories as an afterthought. He edges onto the scene from the side. Michael Newton even wonders if Chesterton is making a joke in his stories. The reader's left thinking not who the criminal is, but who the detective is. Well, despite these difficulties in comparing Father Brown and Clouseau, I've felt encouraged to pursue the approach, as I think the contrast between two detectives who are so unalike, how they look and dress, their speech and demeanour, their approaches to crime detection, might be revealing, more revealing perhaps than comparing two characters who are similar. This can also be the case, I think, in comparing countries. I remember my first trip to America in the 1970s not only brought me, as I expected, a greater understanding of the United States, but also of Australia. It made clear to me Chesterton's comment that the purpose of visiting another country is to discover one's own. In other words, to dispel the cloud of familiarity that shrouds our appreciation so often of what is in front of us. And by seeing a contrasting culture, we gain a fresh insight into the distinctive qualities of our own culture. Chesterton put it this way: the whole object of travel, he said, is not to set foot in foreign lands. It is at last to set foot on one's own country as a foreign land. So in America, for example, I saw the similarities of a modern way of life, of commerce and organisation and lifestyle, but I also became conscious of the differences, such as the American sense of destiny, expressed in Abraham Lincoln's famous description of Americans as the almost chosen people. It's quite different, obviously, from the Australian conception of its history and culture. And we think of James Macaulay's narrative poem, Captain Quiros, about the Portuguese explorer who missed the continent of Australia in 1606, so that we did not become what he wanted to call the South Land of the Holy Spirit, an Iberian settlement and a Catholic culture. We developed as a British penal colony and a secular culture almost 2 centuries later. Macaulay wrote this way, he said, "The Southland would have taken the impression of cross and crown, but heaven willed otherwise. This was the end of our sea enterprise, and we were carried far from our possession." Well, to focus on our main theme, what would we notice if our two detective characters were to meet, Father Brown and Inspector Clouseau? Father Brown's plainly a priest and has the garb and title of a priest. This may be a little surprising at first, that a priest is investigating a crime, not a policeman or a conventional detective. Clouseau is clearly a police detective. He announces himself as such, Inspector Clouseau. But he's an unusually smart-looking one, with his tweed hat and his trench coat, see them in a moment, and an air of rather vain self-assurance. And of course he has a pronounced, if peculiar, French accent that can't cope with simple English words like monkey and funny, which become minky and fiddy. So we'll just show the first clip to get an idea of what a character he was. Thanks, Michael.
Castle authorities from Marseille. Tell me, do you have a ring?
I do not know what a ring.
Zimmer.
A room.
That is what I have been saying, you idiot. Really. Does your dog do that? No? Nice doggy. I thought you said your dog did not bat.
That is not my dog.
In fact, Clouseau might remind us of another detective from France, Hercule Poirot, Agatha Christie's fictional character.
Belgium.
Yes, I'll come to that. It's thought that Clouseau was actually based on Poirot, Poirot being also a smartly attired detective, sporting a manicured moustache and full of rather stately vanity, is how I might describe it. And he speaks with an exaggerated French accent as well, though Poirot, as I can emphasise, is actually Belgian, as in created by Christie. Poirot also comes to mind in the Father Brown stories, in the person of Flambeau, the best-known character apart from Father Brown. So if we just show the next one, Michael, if we could, it's just these are, that most of you would know, but just to compare them, I thought it might be useful to put an image of both of them up. His is obviously less manicured, but it's still cultivated. Thanks, Michael. But anyhow, the character of Flambeau, the best-known character from the Father Brown stories, apart from Father Brown, the best-known character, and he appears in most of the 50 or so stories, including the first one, The Blue Cross. First as a master criminal, and then as a reformed man and a private detective, and finally somebody who's retired. The full name Chesterton gave him was Hercule Flambeau, and it's been suggested that Flambeau influenced Agatha Christie when she created Poirot, as the name she gave him was Hercule Poirot. Now, every fictional character needs to have a distinctive personality, be a recognisable character. No doubt this accounts in part for the tremendous popularity of detective fiction and helps to make the genre so entertaining. This emphasis on personality was once noted by Ronald Knox, who's been mentioned earlier by Richard, the English writer and preacher and also a writer of detective stories. And he published a selection of Father Brown stories in the 1950s. In a foreword to this volume, very interesting introduction to the selection, He pointed out that crime detection is not just a mathematical or machine-like process. The detective must come across as a real person, which means that he needs to have idiosyncrasies and eccentricities. Certainly, Father Brown and Clouseau each has idiosyncrasies. Our priest detective is rather inept, carrying parcels, dropping his hat, losing his umbrella, misplacing his glasses. Chesterton describes him in one story as having bodily disarray and being, he called him, the embodiment of all that is homely and helpless. Our police detective, Inspector Clouseau, takes ineptitude to a new level, entirely. His clumsiness causes chaos wherever he goes. He turns the detective story into a theatre of the absurd, in which even when disguised, and again he'll be disguised in this particular clip, he manages to ruin whatever he touches. So just the next one, thanks Michael.
Fixed your doorbell from the ringing. There is no charge.
What do you want?
I am from the telephone company. There is something the matter with your phone.
My phone?
Huh?
You said there's something the matter with my phone.
Yes.
My phone?
That is correct, yes. That is what I've been saying.
Be nice to be reassured those aren't typical of Inspector Clouseau's detecting abilities, but they too much are. Anyhow, Ronald Knox, in his foreword to the Father Brown stories, observed that the idiosyncrasies of a detective character do have a point. They're intended to put us off the scent. We wonder, could such a person really be a threat to any criminal? Knox thinks that when our detective character appears on the scene of a crime, the general reaction, as Knox expressed it, is a man like that will never be able to get at the truth. It's as if Knox has been exposed to early footage of Clouseau in Pink Panther movies. And yet, this may not just be a matter of levity. Chesterton believes that detective stories are in fact meant to be jokes. The writer is trying to play tricks on the reader. He's trying to mislead us with false hints or characterisations. In an essay in 1925 entitled How to Write a Detective Story, Chesterton formulated a number of principles for a good detective story. And one of these is that the actual criminal needs to be a familiar figure so that he doesn't emerge at the end out of nowhere. He should be in the foreground, though not as the criminal, but in some other capacity, which explains why he is prominent, even though he has up to now been familiar in an unfamiliar and thus unsuspicious function. Without doubt, Clouseau takes to an extreme the detective story as a joke. But perhaps he's simply reversing the joke. Clouseau plays tricks not on the reader, or in his case on the viewer, but on himself. For example, with his unawareness of a menacing police officer in the room and his utter confusion when finally confronting him. So just a further clip.
You must also have met Colonel Sharkey.
Oh, that idiot from the Lucas secret police. Yes, I know him. And when I... Sir Charles Lytton, I arrest you in the name of the law, and I warn you that anything you say will be...
But before you get all worked up, there's something you must know. He intends to kill all of us.
Who?
Colonel Sharkey.
Good Sharky, Colonel God. We were just talking about you.
Well, it's a pity, I think, Clouseau is not around now. With his clarity of thought and expression, he could have been enlisted, I've sometimes thought, as a speech coach for Joe Biden. It's a terrifying coincidence that Peter Sellers played the part in a movie you may have seen called Being There, played the part of a presidential candidate, totally unexpected and enlisted and nominated without even being aware of it. Again, terrible similarities. Anyhow, the idiosyncrasies that Knox highlights as an essential part of the detective character may have a deeper point, and that is that it takes an odd and unusual person to pick up on the odd and unusual, to detect things that most ordinary people would overlook or take for granted. We have echoes here, of course, of a common Chesterton theme, the need to refresh our perception of ordinary life so that we don't overlook or undervalue the important realities that are so familiar. We might think of Chesterton's memorable statement of this truth in his 1904 novel, The Napoleon of Notting Hill. There is a law, he says, written in the darkest of the books of life, and it is this: if you look at a thing 999 times, you are perfectly safe. If you look at it the 1000th time, you are in frightful danger of seeing it for the first time. In his book Orthodoxy, that's been mentioned a few times today, Chesterton's great unfolding of the Christian vision, he reveals that he never lost the sense of wonder that he experienced as a child. And in the chapter The Ethics of Elfland, he makes a phenomenal assertion that God, in his words, is strong enough to exult in monotony. God is strong enough to exult in monotony. Like a child enjoying a game or a joke and pleading for it to be repeated endlessly. The child cries out to the grown-up, "Do it again." And Chesterton ponders, in awe, whether God says every morning, "Do it again," to the sun, and every evening, "Do it again," to the moon. The wondrous repetition in nature, Chesterton thinks, may not be a mere recurrence, but rather a theatrical encore. God just keeps coming back for more, as it were. In the Father Brown stories, perhaps the most famous example of overlooking the ordinary and undervaluing the familiar is in the story The Invisible Man. And here the man who is invisible is simply the man who is not noticed. The postman, as it turns out, who delivers a series of threatening letters to a man he finally murders. No one saw the postman. They all assumed the letters were the work of another person, and therefore the murderer, not the postman. As Father Brown explains near the end of the story, have you ever noticed this, that people never answer what you say, Father Brown said. They answer what you mean or what they think you mean. Suppose one lady says to another in a country house, "Is anybody staying with you?" The lady doesn't answer, "Yes, the butler, the 3 footmen, the parlour maid," and so on, though the parlour maid may be in the room or the butler behind her chair. She says, "There is nobody staying with us," meaning nobody of the sort you mean. But Father Brown goes on, suppose a doctor, inquiring into an epidemic, asks, "Who is staying in the house?" Then the lady will remember the butler, parlour maid, and the rest. All language is used like that. You never get a question answered literally, even when you get it answered truly. When those 4 quite honest men, the ones who were questioned about who had delivered the letters, when those 4 quite honest men said that no man had gone into the mansions, which was the name of the apartment block where the person was murdered, they did not really mean that no man had gone into them. They meant no man whom they could suspect of being your man. A man did go into the house and he did come out of it, but they never noticed him. An invisible man, inquired one of the characters, raising his red eyebrows. A mentally invisible man, said Father Brown. But I think Father Brown's approach goes much deeper than seeing the familiar and the ordinary with fresh eyes. He does not just see reality, he penetrates it. He doesn't just look at the exterior, or at least he looks at the exterior as a channel to the interior. So he sees the crime from within by looking into the mind and the heart of the criminal. He doesn't concentrate on the clues left around or the aspects of the crime that attract the conventional detective, in particular the material details, such as the nature of a poison used in a murder or the exact time of death as determined by rigor mortis. Father Brown does not so much examine the crime as interpret the criminal. As a priest, he peers into the soul of the man. A rather striking example is in the story The Secret of Father Brown, already mentioned, and again I think Simeon used this quote or part of it, so I'll present it in a brief form. But the thrust of this story, which is quite memorable, The Secret of Father Brown, our priest detective's mildly annoyed at a line of questions he's receiving from an American traveller. And the person's name is that Chesterton gives him is Mr. Grandison Chase, a grand name for sure. Mr. Chase is staying as a guest at a Spanish castle where Father Brown is visiting Flambeau, who's now reformed and living in retirement. Mr. Chase is very keen to unlock the secret of Father Brown, the secret of Father Brown's success. And he wonders, as has been mentioned, whether it's due to some special powers the priest has, certainly esoteric, perhaps even occult in character. So Father Brown feels pressed, finally, to tell his secret. And he opens with this dramatic revelation. "You see," he says to Mr. Chase, "it was I who killed all those people. I had murdered them all myself, so of course I knew how it was done." And the listener is shocked. Father Brown goes on, "I planned out each of the crimes very carefully. I had thought out exactly how a thing like that could be done, and in what style or state of mind a man could really do it. And when I was quite sure that I felt exactly like the murderer myself, of course I knew who it was." And Mr. Chase misunderstands what Father Brown's saying. He thinks he's simply probing into the psychology of the criminal and invoking a figure of speech. Not, as Father Brown makes clear, that he's making not a metaphorical point, but a moral point. And he goes on to explain, "I really did see myself and my real self committing the murders. I didn't actually kill the men by material means, but that's not the point. Any brick or bit of machinery might have killed them by material means. I mean that I thought and thought about how a man might come to be like that until I realised that I really was like that, in everything except actual final consent to the action. So Father Brown provides a similar explanation of his method of crime detection in another essay, one of his last ones, another story, The Secret of Flambeau. And here he imagines himself as the murderer who is a revolutionary poet who loves revolt in the modern form, that is pessimistic and promoting anarchy, bent, Chesterton thought, on destruction more than reform. And Father Brown's explanation brings out what he describes rather pithily in a further story, The Hammer of God. He's asked how he can know so much about the criminal mind. "Are you a devil?" asks the inquirer. "I am a man," answers Father Brown, "and therefore have all devils in my heart." I think this can be claimed to be the unique mark, the defining feature of Father Brown's approach to crime detection, that it is spiritual and moral, not just material and psychological. That's the approach of the conventional detective, of course, and certainly in the main of detective characters in literature and movies and TV series. And it's the approach of our Inspector Clouseau. That is, it's material, picking up physical clues, and it's psychological in focusing on the mind and motivation of the criminal. Clouseau focuses on the material and the psychological, though his glory, I think, is what I might call an anti-detective, is he can't really manage to notice the material or comprehend the psychological. Now, it's well known that the inspiration for the, I might just think Michael moved to the final one there, actually, if I could. Yes, please, if you just show that one. This is the final clip.
This reminds me of the younger days of the Cercle Peace Academy. The parallel bars, my speciality. I was something of an athlete, you know. Yes, yes. I was known as the pavlova of the parallels. Yes. Yes, it's all coming back now. I remember. Well, that felt good. Well now, I expect you're all wondering why I asked you here. It's obvious that the night that bought that suit did not last very long. Yes, as I was saying,
You were saying you supposed we were all wondering why you called us.
Look, there is no need for you to speak unless I ask you a question. What is your name?
I'm Shock, the gardener.
What is it you do?
I'm the gardener.
And why didn't you say that to me in the first place?
I did.
Look, don't try to be funny with me, monsieur. This is a very serious matter, and everyone in this room is under the suspicions.
Real?
What? What was that?
You said real.
Yes, I know that. And there is a very good chance that someone in this room knows more about the murder than he is telling.
Murder?
What was that you said?
I said murder.
What murder?
I don't know. You said murder.
I said murder. You said murder.
No, I said murder because you said murder.
I said murder.
You said there was someone in this room who knew more about the murder than he's telling.
Now listen. What was your name?
Shock,
The cook.
gardener.
Ah! Now we are getting somewhere. You!
Are you all right, Stutterstuff.
Who is this man?
He's Mr. Stutterstuff.
I see. And what is your job, Mr. Stuckerstuff?
He's the beekeeper.
I'm not asking you. I'm asking Mr. Stuffstucker. What's that? What is he saying to you? What was that?
He says he's got a bit of a cold and he's lost his voice.
Lost his voice. A beekeeper who has lost his voice. A cook who thinks he's a gardener. And a witness to a murder. Oh, yes. It is obvious to my trained eye that there is much more going on here than meets the ear. Before you are dismissed, Mr. Stiffsticker, I suggest you count your bees. You may find that one of them is missing.
You ruined that piano.
What is the price of one piano compared to the terrible crime that has been committed here?
But that's a priceless Steinway.
Not anymore. What is your name?
Mrs. Lever, Lily.
Mrs. Loveliver, I would take a shrewd guess that you are the housekeeper, am I right?
I have been with Professor Fassbender for 30 years.
That would account for your exaggerated hysteria over a simple blemish on the furniture.
Blemish?
Whatever has happened to the piano can easily be repaired. What has happened to Professor Fassbender and his daughter is another matter. That my hand is on fire.
Gentlemen, what's going on? Oh, good afternoon, sir. Inspector Clouseau has been interrogating the staff. Inspector Clouseau is Superintendent Quinlan. Ah, Inspector.
Superintendent.
Yes, well, the least said about that, the better, but I do have something to say about it soon. Excuse me. It's well known that the inspiration for the character of Father Brown was a priest friend of Chesterton's, Father John O'Connor. And his apparent innocence and unworldliness made a deep impression on Chesterton, who saw that it disguised the depth of his insight into the nature of evil, what Ronald Knox called the byways of human depravity. And that could be best explained, as Chesterton came to realise, by the hours the priest spent listening to sinners in the confessional. As Father Brown says to Flambeau in the very first story, The Blue Cross, has it never struck you that a man who does next to nothing but hear men's real sins is not likely to be wholly unaware of human evil? So these spiritual and moral understandings inform the character of Chesterton's priest detective, and they make him a singular figure in the field of detective fiction. There are copies, as it were, coming out, but he remains, I think, in that form, singular and really unique. At the same time, it's important to note that Father Brown does not ignore the scientific approach. As the American historian Melvin Chernow noted, there is in a number of the stories a discussion of detective science and the intuitive method of deduction. Chernow mentions, for example, The Secret of Father Brown, that we've already quoted from, and The Secret of Flambeau. That's two stories. He also points to Chesterton's discussion of evidence in a couple of stories. One is The Strange Crime of John Boulnois, and a second is the Duel of Dr. Hirsch. Chernow also points out that in the story The Absence of Mr. Glass, Chesterton offers a devastating satire of a scientific detective. His name is Dr. Orion Hood. He's an eminent criminologist, and he extols the scientific imagination and displays a condescending attitude towards Father Brown. He enjoys promulgating his elaborate theories about nature and race. It all sounds very contemporary, doesn't it? Nature and race, theories about it. latching on to those fashionable areas that we're so familiar with. Dr. Hood would have been handy, I'm sure, as a consultant to our present-day educators to advise on how these theories could be incorporated into our school curricula. Well, I mentioned Flambeau earlier. We meet him in the first Father Brown story, The Blue Cross, and he's featured in the movie we'll be watching shortly, The Detective. In fact, he's played by the Australian actor Peter Finch. Flambeau is a master criminal who, under Father Brown's influence, is reformed, and he becomes a detective himself. The conversion of Flambeau seems to me to highlight another distinctive feature of Father Brown, and that is his motivation in detecting the criminal. And I've touched on this earlier, but it bears, I think, teasing out a bit more. Chesterton created a detective who would see into the mind and heart of the criminal, but he wasn't content with that. He also wanted a detective who took a radically different approach to the criminal, who was inspired by a radically different motive. As I said at the start of the conference, Father Brown wanted to catch the criminal, but it was not to charge him and confine him, but to free him, spiritually and morally. That is, to free his soul rather than lock up his body. Now, an insight into Chesterton's thinking can be found in an early essay in 1901, in fact, nearly a decade before he created the character of Father Brown. It's in this book, A Miscellany of Men. And Chesterton's essay is significantly called The Divine Detective, The Divine Detective. And here he offers, I think, an instructive contrast between the state and the church. In effect, a contrast between human law and divine law, between the human law of an imperfect, unredeemed world and the divine law, a law of love, governing a perfect and redeemed world. Chesterton calls the Christian church an enormous private detective, in contrast to what he terms an official detective, the state. The state, Chesterton writes, in all lands and ages has created a machinery of punishment, more bloody and brutal in some places than others, but bloody and brutal everywhere. The church, he goes on, is the only institution that ever attempted to create a machinery of pardon. The church is the only thing that ever attempted by system to pursue crimes, not in order to avenge, but in order to forgive them. He argues that the speciality of the church is what he calls this merciless mercy. It is, he says, an unrelenting sleuth hound who seeks to save and not to slay. Well, to look again at Clouseau, we realise he sits at the other end of crime detection from Father Brown. He lacks the intuition of Father Brown in discerning the criminal, and he also lacks the significant skill of the conventional detective. And as I mentioned earlier, he might be described as an anti-detective, and it's shown in that last clip. He undermines detective work. He misses clues, failing to see things that other people notice. He misremembers details, like the name or occupation of a witness, whether it's the cook or the gardener, or suspect he might be interviewing. So that video clip, I think, started with a rather dramatic display of Clouseau's physical incompetence, and that proved to be a prelude to showing his detective incompetence. In contrast to Father Brown, who also has a certain physical ineptitude, but it disguises his competence as a detective. Well, as Clouseau said after his spectacular entry downstairs, that felt good. And his intellectual powers and speaking ability, as I mentioned earlier, make us wish he were around today to advise and coach a number of our leaders. A terrifying coincidence that I mentioned earlier that I'll pass on was about the presidential candidate, which I'd forgotten about until quite recently. Well, let me touch now finally on another dimension of the program, of our comparison, and that is the physical setting in which both Father Brown and Inspector Clouseau operate as detectives. Father Brown goes to various places, France and Spain and Italy and so on, and Clouseau does as well. But whereas in the Pink Panther movies they're essentially exotic backdrops for cinematic effect, in the case of Father Brown, I think they have a greater meaning. Firstly, Chesterton creates the setting in detail, often in quite imaginative, colourful language. Many of the Chesterton stories contain memorable descriptions of landscapes and other scenes. In one of his early stories, for example, The Sign of the Broken Sword, he opens with this paragraph, which I'll only quote briefly, as we imagine we are looking at a forest and a profusion of trees and branches. This is what he writes. The 1,000 arms of the forest were grey, and its 1,000,000 fingers silver. In a sky of dark green blue like slate, the stars were bleak and brilliant, like splintered ice. All that thickly wooded and sparsely tenanted countryside was stiff with a bitter and brittle frost. And later in the story, Father Brown's talking with Flambeau, and Chesterton offers this description, again in rather graphic language, evocative of both religious and psychological references. And he wrote, "And they plunged into the black cloister of the woodland, which ran by them in a dim tapestry of trunks, like one of the dark corridors in a dream." Now, without doubt, this is Chesterton, the artist. We remember that he was an artist all his life. From his earliest years, he produced drawings. He was certainly an artist long before he became a writer, at which time he became an artist in words. I remember being in Father Ian Boyd's study in New Jersey on one occasion, and he has the collection of original Chesterton's own collection of GK's Weekly, the weekly that he edited for many years. And right through the different issues that I just browsed through the volumes, doodles and drawings and that, as he would be reading what just came out in the issue, he'd be drawing things in the margin. So just an incurable artist. Now, at one level, the descriptions are simply physical, that is, creating an atmosphere for the story, which is important, obviously. But with Chesterton, the descriptions usually have a more profound significance. The American professor of English, Gertrude M. White, once pointed out that the setting is created to carry deeper meanings. It's not just for mood, as she puts it, but for metaphor. That is, its purpose is to produce an imaginative impact, not just a physical ambience. The setting goes beyond the description. It brings in other layers of meaning, literary and historical, and finally religious. For example, at one point in this story I've quoted from, The Sign of the Broken Sword, Father Brown mentions the name of Dante, and Flambeau is puzzled. "What do you mean?" he asks the priest. And in a rather stunning description, I think, Father Brown points to, and I quote, "a puddle sealed with ice that shone in the moon." This physical image and reference then leads into a literary and religious one. Father Brown asks Flambeau, "Do you remember whom Dante put in the last cycle of ice?" "The traitors," answers Flambeau. And he imagines that he was Dante, and that, as Chesterton suggests, drawing on Dante's classical references in his great poem, The Divine Comedy, Father Brown was a Virgil leading him through a land of eternal sins, as Chesterton puts it. So for Chesterton, the setting yields a deeper and richer meaning. It's not an end in itself, it's not just a memorable description, it's a pathway to new insights for the reader. What Chesterton does is reach for something that poetry can often capture more than prose, and that is the ultimate weight and significance of things, a focus on the eternal. I'm reminded of two wonderful lines from one of Les Murray's great poems, Poetry and Religion. And he wrote this: "Nothing's said till it's dreamed out in words, and nothing's true that figures in words only." Now, some years before Chesterton created the character of Father Brown, he was conscious of the value of the detective story. And in an early essay, he thought such a story was quintessentially modern, in the sense that it celebrated what he called the poetry of modern life. He thought the detective story could lift our appreciation of the urban landscape, just as writers in earlier ages celebrated the beauties of the natural landscape. He picked out the distinguishing marks of the city in the early 20th century when he was writing. For example, he said the chimney pots that sat above the chimneys on homes. And in Chesterton's vision, he said they would now be seen as rich a purple as the mountain peaks. Or he picked out the lampposts, which would now appear as old and natural as the trees. Another feature of the modern cityscape was the casual omnibus, as he called it. It would now assume, he thought, a more romantic status. Thinking again of the colourful London bus. It would resemble the primal colours of a fairy ship. I think it's worth noting in passing that Chesterton's love of the poetry of the city poses a challenge to the common caricature that was made of distributism, his social and economic philosophy espoused by Hilaire Belloc and Chesterton especially, as a popular version of the social teaching of the popes, beginning with Pope Leo XIII's encyclical Rerum Novarum in 1891. Distributism has often been misrepresented and mocked at times as yearning for a wholesale reversion to rural life, with everyone having 3 acres and a cow, as was said. But far from seeing the modern life, the modern city, as dull and dismal, Chesterton saw it as more poetic even than the countryside. It was what he called a chaos of conscious forces. He thought every stone and every brick in the city was a symbol, a message from someone who put it there. It has, Chesterton said, an unfathomably human character. As he explains, the narrowest street possesses in every crook and twist of its intention the soul of the man who built it, perhaps long in his grave. It is full, he said, of the romance of detail. By contrast, the countryside is a chaos of unconscious forces, Chesterton suggested, shown in the features of natural growth, such as the crest of the flower or the pattern of the lichen. They may not be significant symbols compared with the deliberate symbols in the street or the wall or the physical structures and monuments. So we can see that when Chesterton came to create Father Brown, he placed him as a priest from Essex, northeast of London, but the settings were invariably in a town or city rather than in the countryside. And I think this testified to Chesterton's special love of the human romance of the city. Well, perhaps a final observation about the detective stories that Chesterton wrote, and that is how well it suited his imagination. I mentioned before how Chesterton's special gift was to reawaken our sense of wonder at the familiar, the ordinary, the common. He compared how God exults in monotony to the childlike love of repetition of a favourite game. Do it again, do it again. The special advantage of the detective story for Chesterton's imagination, I think, is that it is full of surprises, often minor surprises, but surprises nonetheless. It's the unexpected revelation in the story that excites our interest, just as the noticing of an overlooked or an undervalued clue, such as noticing of an overlooked or an undervalued clue, or the penetrating interpretation of a motive. So alerting us to the unfamiliar, as the detective story does, complements in a way our being reawakened to the familiar, gets us used to being surprised. In Chesterton's mind, I think, God grants us the gift of surprise, and he prepares us to be surprised at the ordinary by starting us off with surprise at the extraordinary. Well, I have inevitably, I suppose, given a lot more attention to Father Brown than to Inspector Clouseau. I hope you'll feel somewhat relieved by that. Certainly I know Virginia is. You might think that including Clouseau was just to introduce some fun into the afternoon session of our Chesterton conference, and I can't in all honesty deny it. But no doubt there has been more depth to explore in the literary character of Father Brown than in the movie character of Inspector Clouseau. At the end of The Blue Cross, the first Father Brown story I mentioned, Father Brown speaking with Flambeau, the master criminal, and with Valentin, the head of the Paris police. Father Brown admits that Flambeau betrayed himself in a series of false steps, as when he ordered a ham sandwich on a Friday, not being aware as a priest of the practice of Friday abstinence at that time. But the clincher for Father Brown was when he showed unmistakably that he was only a priest in disguise. He made a fatal error in conversation. "You attacked reason," said Father Brown. "It's bad theology." At that point in the story, Valentin emerged from behind a tree with two other policemen, and Flambeau made a respectful bow to Valentin. But Valentin simply said, "Do not bow to me, mon ami. Let us both bow to our master," by which he meant Father Brown. But I have no doubt that the little Essex priest, as Chesterton described Father Brown, would in turn have bowed to the true master, his literary creator, G.K. Chesterton. Thank you very much.